communications director why it wasn't in the diocesan magazine. So that is the short version of how we kind of got here. Father Nicholas, once again, saving the day. All right. He is a wonderful, not just a priest of God, but a wonderful man and friend. All right. So, to wrap that up, the short version is several months ago, as part of a request from the parish, Father asked me to begin working with Stan, Judge Lotta, Tricia, and a few other parishioners on putting together a good history of St. Peter's, because our last published history was around 45 years ago. So this year, here, can everybody see the screen? All right, even if I'm standing with my big head in front of it. Yes? No? Okay, we'll move off to the side. How about now? All right. St. Peter's celebrates our 185th anniversary. At the same time, we celebrate 179 years under the care of the friars. 170 years in this current church. We are the oldest continually operating parish in West Tennessee. Our parish was a generation old when both modern Germany and Italy came into existence. The U.S. flag only had 26 stars on it when this parish was founded. We've had 47 pastors, well over 120 associate pastors, have provided over 10,000 baptisms in our sacramental records, and the parish has stood witness to countless more weddings, funerals, confessions, masses, celebrated, and charity given. A quick disclaimer before we get started. The events and dates to be presented represent the best information available at the time of composition. History is hard, and telling truthful stories is even harder when the relevant information is scattered across dozens of sources, often in antique faded newsprint or recorded in the cursive Latin script used in old church records. Often these stories are captured from multiple perspectives and traditions, and the standards of both scholarship and journalism have waxed and waned over the decades. I'm sure there are going to be some details here that change under further review, but everything you will hear today is accurate as possible. Actually, I have a really good example of this. Between composing this slide deck and giving this presentation today, I was playing around with census records from 1900, as one is wont to do. And we believe we finally located St. Peter Sam in the census records of 1900. Not only can we now give you his official job title, but we found out that he may be up to a decade younger than we thought, even as late as a week ago. So as we gather more data in, our understanding of these things change. Also, this isn't the subject of today's talk, but it's worth noting, unsurprisingly, is a southern parish and what was a major economic hub of the Old South. That our parish, especially in its earliest decades, profited from what can only be termed blood money. As among some of our prominent founding families included slave owners and that made their living off of the greater slave economy. In fact, if you look into our sacramental records, and Judge Lotta is a better resource on this, you'll find baptismal and sacramental records of enslaved people. I think as Catholics, it's worth reflecting on the nature of grace and that often those guilty of great evil acts are as equally capable of great good and reconciliation, especially through the sacraments offered by the church. I do not judge the hearts or salvation of those men and women, but just as children grow up and become aware that their parents are real people with real vices and real virtues they have, that we must be aware of the reality and humanity of those individuals who form the foundational history of our parish community. We've just got to be aware of who we come from and where we come from. So, moving on. So West Tennessee was opened up for settlement in 1819, and this is a digital copy of the first plan of the city of Memphis. And this is a map from a few decades later showing Plot 409 where our parish is established. This is where we are right now. The greater Catholic picture, though, is just as interesting. So, in 1808, before 1808, the only diocese in North America was, primarily English-speaking, was in Baltimore. I'm sorry, I will not forget the French and Spanish in New Orleans.
We were part of the diocese before this.
So, Baltimore, and the United States into 4 additional dioceses: Philly, New York, Boston, and Bardstown, one you've probably not heard of. Today is the Archdiocese of Louisville. And Bardstown had all of this, essentially everything else that was the contiguous United States west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1837, the Diocese of Nashville was established under Bishop Richard Pius Miles. Bishop Miles, when he was only 46, but he was already an experienced missionary pastor and spiritual father who belonged to the very young Dominican province of St. Joseph in the United States. It had just turned 32 years old the year that the Diocese of Nashville was established. Bishop Miles was 15 when he entered the novitiate. Originally, the Diocese of Nashville had just 100 registered families, no permanent parishes, and no officially assigned priests except a few missionaries. However, when Bishop Miles would pass away in 1860, he would be able to boast to his God of a diocese now counting over 12,000 registered Catholics, 3 diocesan priests, 14 parishes, 6 chapels, 13 additional missions, a seminary and a hospital, including here in Memphis. Father Joseph Stokes, we do not have a picture of Father Joseph. We do not even have a picture of his gravestone. I think we've tracked down his final resting place, but he was also a missionary priest. Came to Memphis in 1839, at the invitation of the city founders of Memphis. The city fathers of Memphis understood that the new waves of Irish immigrants would provide great economic muscle and trade to this new city. However, in order to keep Irish Catholics in the city, you have to have what? A parish. Now, they had to make it as attractive as possible for Bishop Miles to establish one of his precious resources in Memphis. So, when Father Stokes rolled into town, they turned to Eugene McGivney, who had arrived in the city as a poor Irish immigrant, and by 1839 had already established himself. He'd begun his economic climb. He continued to live his entire life in this little house next door, though he died a millionaire. Unfortunately, amongst his other human vices, it seems that he did indeed profit from the slave trade. Eugene McGivney was also, though, a huge proponent of public education and education. He built the first school in Memphis that we know of. It was a little log school that was built on Fort Square. And this is where the first public address of Father Stokes to the Catholic community came. Now, there were not enough Catholics in Memphis yet for it to fill up even this little schoolroom, so Protestants packed the rafters to show that there was indeed interest in Bishop establishing a parish here in Memphis. The first Mass that we know of in the modern era occurred at Eugene McGivney's house right next door in 1839. In 1840, the first wedding was celebrated between Eugene McGivney and his bride. In 1841, the first baptism was also celebrated, and these count amongst the early sacramental records in our parish records.
Did you mention the fact that that school was for boys only?
Yes, sorry. I should have clarified. The school was for boys only. Girls' education was not seen as a critical necessity at that time in the city of Memphis.
So the Dominican sisters right.
We will get there.
They're stealing your thunder.
So, Father Stokes, after celebrating Mass and addressing a packed schoolhouse in late 1839, did confirm to Bishop Miles that there was a need for a Catholic parish here in Memphis. Beating out other contenders, including Ashport, amongst others, some places that don't even exist on a map anymore. So in 1840, Father McAleer was appointed the first pastor, also a missionary priest. And this is our only known depiction of the original St. Peter's parish. If you notice, it actually turns in a completely different way than today. Here's Adams, and there is 3rd. So the front door of the church was directed towards 3rd Street. When I brought this depiction to Linus Hugh, he pointed out that this is not some weird avant-garde roof. This is clearly a perspective issue, because nobody was being this experimental in the architectural community in Memphis in 1840. So Father McAleer was appointed until 1846. 1846. In 1841, Plot 409 was conveyed to the diocese for a nominal price of $500. In today's money, that would be around $18,619. Mostly raised through subscription by the Protestant community. Again, trying to, I'm sure charity and love had something to do with it, but also, if we want these skilled artisans and laborers, we need to make sure that they have a place to worship. And so, in the summer of 1842, construction on this 30 by 70 foot brick church was commenced, finished in 1843 for a cost of $5,000, around $197,000 in today's money. However, in 1846, Father McAleer had enough of his time on the missions and wanted to go back east. Well, Bishop Miles had a dilemma. He had this new, and by 1846, thriving community in Memphis that needed stability. He had less than 3 permanent assigned diocesan priests. All of his other priests were missionaries. Well, Bishop Miles, being a Dominican friar, turned to his brothers in the Dominican order and asked them to take charge of St. Peter's. In 1847, in order to sweeten the pot, the parish was deeded over to the Dominican order. And as far as I've been able to tell, only one other parish in the United States, Dominican parish in the United States, is owned by the order. That would be St. Dominic's in Denver. Because of the Dominican friars being here and having charge of the parish since 1846, we are the 4th oldest continually operating Dominican ministry in the U.S. We do not have time to talk about all of the pastors that served, but I did want to highlight the first 3 Dominican pastors because I find them very interesting. And I think they provided a lot of the seed corn for what our parish has grown into over the last 185 years. This is Father Joseph Sadik Alamani. He was a Spaniard, one of the few non-American or Irish Dominicans in the U.S. at the time. He served till 1848, at which point he was called to be the provincial of the province of St. Joseph. And then later on a few years later, he was called on to be the first bishop of Monterey, California, and then eventually the first archbishop of San Francisco. And he assisted in founding the Western Dominican province. Father Clarkson we'll talk about quite a bit later. Needless to say, died as a martyr of charity. We'll get into his story in a few minutes. Father Thomas O. Grace, is probably the most foundational who St. Peter's would become. He served as our pastor for a decade before being asked to serve as the 2nd bishop of St. Paul, Minnesota. In his decade here, he built the foundation of what would become St. Peter's Orphanage, St. Peter's Parochial Day School. In 1851, he worked with Bishop Miles the records differentiate on whether it was a request or an order from the bishop for the Dominican sisters to come here and found St. Agnes Academy. An interesting fact for those educators and organizers in the room, they arrived January 1st, 1851 at midnight on an icy, packed Mississippi River. And within 6 weeks had a school up and running with students and boarders. Thus proving that the Dominican sisters are probably the feistiest and scariest ladies in the church. Don't stand in their way and they will find a way to do it.
Another thing to remember about early education in those times, it was so rare that a young person be educated that a boarding school was often common. You just had to go and leave them there because you lived so far away, and it was a treacherous route often, that boarding schools were very, very prevalent. And we actually had a physically built school attached to our church.
So by 1852, it was noted that Father Thomas Grace knew we needed a bigger space. The Irish were pouring in. We had a small an active German population who would later split off to form St. Mary's German Catholic Church of the Immaculate Conception just up the street. And we needed more room. And in fact, we have the records of Father Grace actually publishing the request for architectural proposals in the Catholic Papers of 1852. So, in 1852, a young Catholic architect named Charles Patrick Keeley, who would go on to do a great amount of work, and today is not the scope to talk about his amount of work, was selected to construct St. Peter's. Work began in 1852, it was finished in 1855, and as an interesting side note, until 1854, they built our current church around the existing church. And they continued to have Mass in the church until 1854, when, due to the needed construction, they disassembled the old parish brick by brick, piece by piece, and carried it out the front doors. They would go on to have Mass in a few other places until the church was finished in 1855. On January 17, 1858, Bishop Miles would come to dedicate and consecrate the new church. Also in attendance were Bishop Spalding of Louisville, who would go on to be Archbishop of Baltimore, the primary American see at the time, and Bishop Elder of Natchez, Mississippi. So we had 3 bishops at our dedication Mass. Bishop Spalding preached the Mass, and according to the records, he preached for over an hour. So this was a solemn high Mass. For those of you in the choir, though, our choir was getting rave reviews even in 1858. So to go through a dedication, a solemn high Mass, and an hour's worth of preaching, they were probably in the church for 3 hours that morning. And then that evening, Bishop Miles presided over the confirmation of over 100 children in convents. So, quite the busy day for the bishops. We'll also talk about in a minute. Came up to the church in 1859 when he was serving as provincial. And this is from his diary. On awakening, found myself at the Memphis Bluff. It was so high that I looked in vain for the city. E. Byrne came down to the boat. With him, went up to the church. The new church is really magnificent affair. It's 150 long, 60 wide, transeptated. It is plastered on the outside of the imitation stone. It seems to me that Memphis is beyond a doubt the finest place our order possesses in this country, and I present it as the best opening for future success. Once I did not think so, but I am convinced of it now from ocular demonstration. So moving to our second half, we now have a new church, but I want to kind of go back and kind of talk about the fevers and diseases that ravaged our community, and that would lay the groundwork for the heroes of St. Peter's that would come along. The first disease that we have record of hitting us in a number to affect our community was a smallpox outbreak in 1848. Smallpox, thankfully, has been eradicated from the modern world. But it was a viral infection that has since been eradicated. Symptoms include vomiting and fever, followed by formation of ulcers and skin rashes. These rashes would then develop into blisters. Mortality for a population would rise as high as 30%, depending on the variety and the impact. Immediately after the smallpox outbreak kind of receded, the city was hit with an outbreak of cholera in 1849. Cholera is a bacterial infection. It's spread through unsafe water and contaminated food. While symptoms include nausea and vomiting, the real killer of this disease is dehydration. Through means such as diarrhea and others, the body will lose up to 5 gallons of fluid a day. With cramps, muscle pains, low blood pressure, increasing heart rate, which will give name to the nickname of the disease, the Blue Death. Eventually, you would move into lethargy, sunken eyes, secondary infections, rising fevers, coma, and death. While much lower today, still affects much of the third world. Untreated, the disease's mortality would rise as high as 50%. In fact, due to the nature of the disease, we actually do not have any good numbers on what the death toll in Memphis was during the 1849 outbreak. And to put it into context, the cholera outbreak of 1849 was part of the larger Tennessee cholera pandemic or epidemic of 1849, and the global third cholera global pandemic, which left over 1 million people dead around the world. This is Father James Clarkson. He was our second Dominican pastor, third pastor overall. He's born in 1812, ordained in 1835, and sent to Memphis in 1847. He would serve as our pastor from 1848 till his death in 1849. It appears from sources Father Clarkson worked himself to exhaustion before succumbing to cholera. The record is actually in disagreement about which disease he died from, because it appears that he suffered and was struck by both. But he continued to work and provide sick calls, the sacraments, and care and charity for the community until he died. He was so well regarded that the Protestant-led secular Memphis Eagle, the newspaper of the day, would lament his death, describing all of his works in pastoral and sacramental care as a martyr of charity, which is a word that we've now just begun hearing used in Catholic theology of saints, a martyr of charity. Mother Teresa is often called a martyr of charity. Father Clarkson, by the Protestant papers of his day, was termed a martyr of charity. He worked himself into exhaustion, was seen all around town, and finally gave in and died. A second tribute was published in the Catholic Telegraph on September 13th. Though unsigned, this moving tribute is commonly attributed to Bishop Miles himself, who had known Father Clarkson since his youth. He was buried first near the church, and when he was disinterred somewhere around 2 decades later, those attendants, including several friars, among them his own brother, and the leading families of the parish described him as incorrupt, looking as if he had just fallen asleep. His cheeks were still rosy, his flesh pliable. I don't want to know how they figured that out. And he was transferred, and he is one of the 3 priests today that now lies below our sanctuary. Memphis was then hit by waves of yellow fevers, or fever seasons, from 1855 through 1879. Yellow fever is a terrible disease that is passed through mosquitoes. And the best estimate we have for the fever epidemics of 73 to 79 is 7,500 Memphians were killed. Into this comes Father Joseph Augustine Kelly, who would serve as our pastor 4 times. In 1863, right after he was named pastor, also after having served first as provincial and as rector of a college, he was named the administrator of the Diocese of Nashville when the Bishop of Nashville had to resign during the Civil War. His association with our parish would be pretty constant, though, from 1868 until his death. Through his life, he was repeatedly offered the chance to serve as a bishop and turned it down every time, preferring to stay with his brothers and then especially the community in Memphis. In 1873, he came down with yellow fever and survived. If you read his own diary, he talks about, he thanks the nurses and the doctors, but also discusses the fact that he himself was near death. And this follows a period where they lost 4 other friars within a 2-week period. He survived, and through the fevers of 78 and 79, he became a one-man Red Cross machine. He started a national call for charity that circled through the Catholic Telegraph and other papers, asking for funds to be sent to Memphis. He was famous for riding with his team of horses in a wagon through the city, giving charity. And most importantly, and probably where he's most well known, was the rescue of orphans. Father Kelly had a heart for orphans, and his parents were struck down by this disease. The city was in such a bad place that we weren't technically a city anymore by 1878. We had lost our charter. And the Federal Army and the Guard, or what would become the Guard, the militia, had the city under quarantine. There was a blockade in and out of the city. Well, Father Kelly knew that if he left these orphans in the sick part of the city, that they would die. Well, there had been refugee camps established outside of the city limits. Father Kelly would run these blockades through force of will, through charity. Many of these soldiers would have been Irish and Catholic, so there was probably some don't mess with the priest buddy atmosphere. and he would just run the blockades and saved. I don't even think we have a good number of the number of orphans he saved. However, we do know that at his funeral mass in 1885 here, the orphans he saved came together to honor him, and they lined up 2 by 2 outside the doors of the church, from his coffin outside the doors of the church, heading towards where the Justice Building is now. And they each placed a flower on his casket. He is our second of our priests underneath, or he's the third priest underneath our altar. There's a few other stories I want to tell. The next one I want to tell is Father Cleary, who is our second priest under our altar. He was born in 1826, ordained in 1850. And he is this young man. When he was ordained, he served as a circuit priest. So he would ride up and down around the Mississippi Valley ministering to Catholic families, providing the sacraments. At 29 years old, he caught the yellow fever and died. In the yellow fever epidemic of 1855, and was buried. He is the completion of our 3 priests underneath the sanctuary. So it's Father Cleary, Father Kelly, and Father Clarkson. The other 2 friars here, and we could talk all day about the different stories of the friars, but Father Sheehy and Father Scannell, one in 1873 and one in 1878. Neither of them were assigned to St. Peter's. However, the number of friars and priests being killed in the city were atrocious, and it began to link through the province. And the provincials, at that time in 73 and 78, made the wise and judicious decision not to let any other friars go to Memphis, because he couldn't afford to lose that much manpower. Father Sheehy and Father Scannell, both 5 years apart, got on their knees and begged to the provincial, asking to be sent to Memphis. And each time, the provincial finally gave in to their begging and pleas, because in 73, for the first time ever, we had a break in the mass schedule here, because everybody was sick, including Father Kelly. They were sent to Memphis, and within 2 weeks each of arrival, they were both dead. If that's not heroic virtue, I don't know what is. And my reason for talking about these, and yes, I do think that there should be a cause for canonization open for these men, and the sisters we'll talk about in a minute, that especially growing up in a post-Boston Spotlight world and a post-2018 world, the clergy often gets a rough reputation, and rightfully so for the crimes committed. However, it's good to cling on to the fact that at a time when our nation was so young men who were in love with the gospel came from, many of these young men were born in France or Ireland or Spain, and they came here to the frontier at the time and died for their people so that they could have the sacraments. And if that's not heroic virtue, I really don't know what is. This is a list of Dominicans lost in the line of duty here in Memphis. The ones highlighted I want to talk about, we've already talked about Father Clarkson and Father Cleary. If you see a date, this is the fever or outbreak they died in. 73, 73, 73, Sister Cecilia in 78. Sister Veronica and Sister Dolores were both novices, and they made their perpetual promises on their deathbed and died later those days. Sister Josepha, Sister Dolores, Mother of Francis Gable, who was the superior of the community, and Sister Catherine Rentz all died on the same day in the 1878 outbreak. Sister M. Lawrence Gable was Mother of Francis' little sister, and she died about 3 days later. And then Father Reveille is the last of the yellow fever priest, and I did want to highlight Father Gorman, who was pastor here in 1949, who died, who was our last pastor to die in the line of duty. He was making a sick call on a parishioner. The parishioner was in an emotionally distraught state. There was an accident. Father Gorman went down the staircase and broke his neck. St. Peter's Sand. So, as I discussed at the beginning of the talk, we're still finding more and more about Sam every day. When I composed the slide deck, I would have told you Sam was born around 1822. Now we know that that extends somewhere between 1820 and 1832, based on census records. But we can now tell you that it was based on the records. He was born in the state of North Carolina, enslaved. Eventually, after the Civil War, I think by 1870, he had made his way to Memphis, and he was working as a day carpenter and as a lay minister in a local black congregation. Based on census data, Sam could neither read nor write. So Sam would sneak into the back of the parish and would listen to the friars preach on Sundays, and then he would take those homilies to his own congregation to expound the gospel. Eventually, we believe that Sam converted, and the term usually used in our history is groundskeeper. In the census of 1900, Sam referred to himself as the sexton, which is a fancy term for the facilities manager of a church. Sam is probably most famous for his work during the yellow fevers of 78 and 79. As I said, the city had lost its charter. The city was in a terrible position. Violence was in the street. We weren't less than a decade past the anarchy in Memphis, the Memphis riots that saw many African Americans executed and lynched. And Sam was serving as our groundskeeper in a predominantly white, it was a white Irish Catholic parish. The city, 25,000 citizens had left, over 7,500 died, and into this steps Sam and the friars. The friars obviously felt the need to go on sick calls, day and night. Well, fearing for the friars' life, Sam would follow the friars out on sick call in the night, known by his cape and his lantern that he would follow the friars around town. The friars, of course, weren't concerned about their own safety. They were concerned about this black man in Memphis who wasn't just, one target of the Ku Klux Klan, but was two targets of the Ku Klux Klan for his association with Catholics. And so they would beg Sam to turn around and go home. Nobody knew yet in 1879 or 1878 exactly how this disease operated. And so they would beg Sam not to go with them on sick calls as they went into the lion's den of the fevers. And Sam would go, "No, it's okay, I'm coming with you." And he would follow behind them, making sure they got to the route safely and got back. Over the course of the 78 and 79 fire season, 9 priests, 8 of them Dominican friars, would catch the fever. All 9 of them would pass away. Sam wasn't just their facilities manager, wasn't just their guard on walk, but he was also in charge of nursing them in our rectory as they got sick and they passed away. And Sam, who had already done one dangerous thing of going into the fever sections, then would do the second dangerous thing of nursing yellow fever victims, then did the third dangerous thing, the third death sentence. He would clean their body and dress them for burial. 8 of those friars he buried in their habits because they were Dominicans. 1 was a secular priest, and so he did not. Then Sam would oversee their burials. He chose time and time again to go into death in harm's way. Sam would continue to be a member of this parish until 1907 when he would pass away. Sam, a black man, received a solemn high funeral mass at the high altar here. There was a Dominican priest, Dominican deacon, Dominican subdeacon, and 8 Irish Catholic white priests in 1907 served as his pallbearers and buried him in Calvary Cemetery. There's not even really words to talk about how different this was. This is, and Christina made a good point to me. We were not an exceptionally progressive parish. Don't look at this and think that, oh look, we were on the cutting edge of liberalism. Everybody's welcome. Black parishioners, what few we had to sit at the back. The earliest black converts to Catholicism who were baptized had enslaved marked to their name. This is a parish that it was built on slave money. But Sam somehow was able to kind of fight through that through his charity and his love. And I think it really did change something in the parish, because in the 1880s, in this room, one of the first educational efforts at educating poor black students in Memphis was in this room, in the Crystal Room, until it was moved to the orphanage because it outgrew the size, until it was shut down. And then when the Bishop of Nashville saw the need to outreach to the African American community before the Josephite community arrived, that mission was handed to the Dominican friars of this parish. Furthermore, I've seen photos from the 40s and 50s of our sanctuary, and at the time, Blessed Martin de Porres has a prominent place in our sanctuary. So clearly something happened. But for all of the good, and I think Sam should be a saint based on what we know, this man was different. And I think he brought about a conversion in our community in some ways.
Randy, in your research, did you ever read that he was given a last name?
So here's what we've been able to figure out. Is in 1870, there's a Samuel Henderson in Memphis at the time. That seems to match his description. And based on his birth, we're still chasing this down, is being born into slavery and maybe liberated in North Carolina. There are a lot of other African American Hendersons around the place where he was born. We think it was Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. Judge Law and I have been texting each other back and forth with different things as we've kind of been diving into the records and trying to identify. But part of the problem is Sam, like we said, couldn't read and couldn't write. And obviously, for those born into slavery, I hate to say it this way, but the only records you have are bills of sale. And bills of sale did not recognize last names, did not respect family relationships. And so trying to track down anything we can on a formerly enslaved person is incredibly difficult. We think Sam was married, based on our records we found from 1900. It also seems that Sam adopted 2 children at about the same time. Whether they were previous children of his wife or other, we're not real sure yet. But it does seem that there were 2 adopted children living with him in the house. Servant of God, Joseph Dutton, who's probably the next, and it's actually the furthest along the calls to canonization. He was born in 1843. He was a Third Order Secular Franciscan. He served in the Union Army from 1861 to 1865. He entered the church here in Memphis at St. Peter's, baptized by Father Kelly on his birthday in 1883. He was born Ira Dutton. He moved with his family to Wisconsin. There in 1861, he was enlisted as a private in the 13th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. He would serve through the war, rising to be quartermaster sergeant of the company, and eventually be commissioned and served as the quartermaster of the regiment through 1865. And he actually talks in his diaries in a few places of being harassed by Confederate cavalry. Sources differ on whether he married during or shortly after the war, but appears to have been short and happy. While young Ira seems to have been in love, she was a woman of ill repute who left him, taking his money with her before taking up with another man. After the Civil War, he became known as a functional alcoholic, working in odd jobs. Shortly after the war, he assisted in recovering fallen Union soldiers and relocating them to the new federal cemeteries. After this, he bounced from job to job, gambling and drinking from town, working on the railroad, then in a distillery, which is a great job if you're an alcoholic. Eventually, he moved to Memphis and began working as a reparations agent, essentially a fancy insurance agent. Those families that had remained loyal to the Union Army who had suffered damage from the war could apply for federal grant money or insurance money, essentially, to receive reparations. And he was here to make sure that no fraud was taking place. He quit drinking on July 4th, 1876, and he eventually made friends with the Semmes family, S-E-M-M-E-S, Brother Morellian, the president of CBHS, Sister Margaret O.P. of St. Agnes, and as he fell in love with the Catholic faith, he was catechized directly by the sisters. And as I said, on his birthday, Father Kelly baptized him. He took the name Joseph as his confirmation saint. And Mrs. Benedict Sims was his godmother. And just to kind of give an example of how complicated our parish history is, the S-E-M-M-E-S family, that Sims, were cousins to the noted Catholic Confederate Admiral Raphael Sims, whose daughter was also a parishioner around the same time and actually paid for the installation of our Mary altar. Miss Benedict Sims was married to a former Major Benedict Sims in the Confederate Army, but her son would go on to attend Annapolis Naval Academy, retire as a vice admiral before passing away at 94 years old, and had won the Navy Cross in World War II for protecting a destroyer that ran aground during landing operations in the Pacific. So just to kind of give you a glimpse into how complicated and interwoven our history is, because amongst his friends were also the founders of CBHS and the principal at St. Agnes. He felt like the rest of his life he needed to make right the things he had done wrong when he was a drunk and an alcoholic. Eventually, he found his way to Gethsemane Abbey, where he spent around 1.5 years with the monks. Kind of figuring out that it wasn't his vocation, he bounced around, and a priest friend gave him essentially a pamphlet on Father Damien of Molokai. Father Damien of Molokai, for those that aren't aware, St. Damien of Molokai was a Belgian priest who had come to the Hawaiian Islands to serve the lepers. The best way to treat leprosy in that time period was to essentially quarantine them into their own space and let them suffer and die. Because that way you couldn't catch the disease. Father Damien saw how unfruitful this was, volunteered to go and move to the leper colony full time. He built the church there by hand, and he served them until his own death from leprosy years later. Well, Joseph Dutton shows up, says, "I'm here to volunteer." No letter ahead, by the way, he just shows up, which is definitely a much bigger deal in the 1880s. And Father Damien's like, okay, well, let's see if this guy's for real. So his first job was to bathe the sores of the lepers. Because if you're not real serious to the mission, that'll turn you around real quick. What Damien did not expect is for Brother Joseph to go, yeah, okay, let's do it. And he happily served the community until his death in 1931. Many of the reasons we know of Father Damien's name now in modern culture and his cause for sainthood is because of Brother Joseph. Brother Joseph, through his connections here at St. Peter's, became pen pals with Robert Louis Stevenson, Theodore Roosevelt, multiple U.S. senators and presidents. The people here at St. Peter's provided funds to the Molokai colony. That same Sims family I was talking about earlier, the one descendant of the Confederate admiral, one of his daughters was married to the Secretary of War in Teddy Roosevelt's cabinet. So he knew Teddy. He had also been part of the peace party to Japan. And so essentially, through the rest of his life on Molokai, while he was physically he was carrying on correspondence with the powerful around the world, telling him of the work of Damien. When the Great White Fleet passed by the colony of Molokai, Teddy Roosevelt had included orders to the admiral that they should stop and dip their flags to Brother Joseph. He passed away in 1931. He is now officially a servant of God. For those that don't know, the servant of God is the first of the 3 official steps in the process to being canonized. After servant of God and the investigation is complete, if the Holy Father feels it will be advanced to venerable. And the third and final step is beatification, where you become blessed. And then after the course is complete and it's changed throughout history, you will be named officially a saint, canonized, and open to public worship or public veneration. As we wrap up, these are other important dates in the history of the parish. 1849 is one of our approximate founding dates for the St. Peter's Parochial School. 1851, the Dominican sisters arrived to found St. Agnes. 1852, we have the foundation of St. Peter's Orphanage. 1865, meeting of the first St. Vincent de Paul Society in Memphis. 1871, the Christian Brothers arrived in Memphis at invitation of the friars to open a boys' school. 1891, Sodality Hall, where we're standing today, was erected. 1900, wow, that didn't format right. The stained glass above the high altar is installed in the church is wired for electricity. We were the first Catholic church in the city and the first church in the city to be wired for electricity. 1901, the establishment of the Knights of Columbus, Council 616, there's a picture of them over there. was established. We were originally the oldest Knights establishment in West Tennessee, and now that council has moved over to the cathedral. 1910 to 1915, we had our first major renovation, installation of all the stained glass windows and present altars. 1923 was the installation of our current organ. I won't talk about that. Talk to Miss Jane if you want to hear about that. 1924 was the dedication of our World War I memorial. 82 saw the second renovation. 91 saw the renovation of the rectory and the parish offices. 2001, dedication of the new St. Martin Shrine and construction of the new building where our parish hall is today. And 2015, the shrine was elevated to the rank of a national shrine. Last thing I want to talk about before we close is heritage and responsibility. These photos are from the St. Martin de Porres Mass held at the Priest Mound in 2022. And I really like these photos because this Mass took place on the Priest Mound in honor of St. Martin de Porres. And Father Roseby here is the son of the Western Province. But what they're doing is they're celebrating Mass and praying the whole Dominican family together, literally on the bones of their fathers in faith. Since the earliest days of the church, altars have had relics placed inside them. And so they're literally standing on hollow ground, doing the things that those friars came around from the world to do, and see to the sacraments and the pastoral care of people. For me, this is a perfect image of what the parish is called to do, and its mission is supporting the Dominican friars. Thank you. This is from a famous 1870 bird's eye view of the city. And I focused in on where St. Peter's is, and the rectory, and the surrounding neighborhood. So this is from an 1870 bird's eye view of the city, and I kind of zoomed in and down the parish. I want to thank you to all of those that have helped start this effort. I want to thank my wife, Catherine, for her support in my session of needing to know exactly what happened. I want to thank Father Scott and Christina for arranging this opportunity. I want to thank Ms. Jane for supplying several resources. My new partners in this hunt, Judge Lotta and Stan, Trisha Dress, and finally as well, Fathers Augie and Fathers JD for encouraging these hunts as well. Thank you especially for all of you attending here. We have just a few minutes for questions because it went over time.